What if rewiring a child's early brain development could change the entire course of their life? Lara Barnes discovered this firsthand, and now she's helping families turn struggle into strength. As a primitive reflex specialist trained in functional neurology, she helped her own son overcome speech, sensory, and anxiety challenges, and now empowers other parents to do exactly the same. In this episode, we dive into how early reflexes shape learning, behaviour, and well-being, and what to do to support brain development through targeted interventions. If you are caring for someone else, whether paid or unpaid, and no matter how many hours you do it, did you realise that you may be missing out on thousands of pounds of discounts for things that you may use every day? The Able to Care podcast is proud to be sponsored by the UK's #1 carers card. Started by two best friends who recognise that carers deserve better and are 100% committed to helping to change the lives of all carers and bringing them together as a strong community. Carers Card UK provides support, recognition and rewards. It offers reassurance by providing an ID card that helps access emergency information when needed, while also unlocking discounts, a wellbeing hub, a carers circle tool and a community through their app. All of this for less than the price of a box of chocolates a year. There are discounts on gym membership, days out, electrical goods, clothing and even glasses. Let others know you care while taking a little care of yourself with an ID card you can be proud of. Visit carerscarduk.co.uk/promo code/able to care today to order yours. Hello and welcome back to the Able to Care podcast. I'm your host, Andy Baker, and today's episode explores a fascinating and often overlooked aspect of child development called primitive reflexes and how they impact on learning, behaviour, and a child's emotional well-being. Joining us today is Lara Barnes, a primitive reflex specialist trained in functional neurology under Dr. Robert Melillo. Driven by her son's struggles with speech, sensory processing and anxiety, Lara learned how retained reflexes could be holding her child back and how releasing them can set them free. What began as a personal journey to help her son has now become a mission, helping other parents change their child's development paths as well. So thank you so much for joining us, Lara. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on. I'm loving all the books behind you as well.
All my neurology and brain books, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can't see sort of Janet and John books, so it definitely looks like it's quite high level reading you're doing.
Yeah, they're all gut health or brain or, how to transform yourself inside and out with regards to all the challenges and things that I've been through.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to talk to you about it. And we're going to jump into straight away. Obviously, in the introduction there, I mentioned obviously this primitive reflexes. So I think we should start there because I don't think many people would have understood that concept. So could you explain what primitive reflexes are and why they matter beyond babyhood?
So these are automatic movement patterns that babies are born with. And they respond to specific sensory stimulation. So I wish I was told this when I came out with my little Emma's diary out of the hospital when I had him. But these reflexes are developed in utero. So they are part of that child right from the beginning. And it helps them come down the birth canal. So if you've had problems and complications in your birth, my son came out stargazing. I didn't even realize that was something that I needed to watch out for. But if they don't come out the right way or they get stuck or they end up through cesarean, those reflexes are not being used as they come down and wiggle themselves down and engage their head to come down the birth canal. And these reflexes are controlled by the lowest level of the brain and the spinal cord and brain stem. So when a baby comes out, they effectively only have a brainstem, and within that brainstem are these reflexes, and they have respiratory system, and their heart rate is a lot higher at that point in time. So they help us make our way down the birth canal, and they help us survive those first few months before we learn to do things for ourselves. So the baby feeding and putting their hand out and holding your finger and all of those different things are helping grow their brain because they've only come out with a brainstem. And every time you would put your finger into a baby's palm, you're effectively helping the neurons fire because of that movement up to the brain and help stimulate and grow that brain. So they help us practice those movement patterns, which you will use later in life. As you start to develop it through the age of 12 months, you start to move way more, and you roll over, and you're using, every time you're rolling or crawling or standing and walking, eventually you're activating that network development and helping your brain develop for those reflexes to go within. So by the age of about 12 months, most of those reflexes should be gone. You have, there's one that might integrate a bit later, but that's for, other reasons. But those reflexes are there to help you stimulate. They're used by stimulating the sensory system, but effectively they help you develop through those milestones in those first 12 months.
Right. Okay. So why are they important then after that first 12 months? Where do they impact on?
Well, they're effectively growing your brain in the right way. And it's like a symphony orchestra. Every instrument needs to play at the right time, and it's a timing thing. So, if you think about a baby when they crawl, they're in sync. Their right leg moves with their, left hand, and then it's the right hand and the left leg, and it's a synchronicity type of movement, and that's the timing of the brain. So how the brain grows is a synchronicity type of event. It happens, that one side of the brain grows, then the other side of the brain grows, but these reflexes help the brain develop. And then as the brain, because the brain is, you have a brain stem, and it's literally just, when you see it in a picture, it looks like, your fist and your wrist. But the brain grows outwards first to your ears and then grows front to back. And so how the brain develops, your executive functioning is at the front of your brain. And so you really need to help. Those reflexes are developed through the growth of that brain, and they integrate once they get to the frontal lobes. And those frontal lobes are really, really important. Those frontal lobes develop all the way through to, you're 20. But the first 12 months is so important for the synchronicity, for those reflexes to integrate. So, you might have reflexes like the Moreau should integrate by about, 4 months old. And that's that fright or flight when a baby jumps in the cradle, and you're cradling them, or they hear a loud bang and they're in the cot and they jump. That should really integrate by about 3 to 4 months. But lots of children have huge amounts of anxiety and are very jumpy. And I still have my Moreau, and every time the dog barks, I jump. So, I know I have these reflexes, and I've effectively, by not having them integrated myself, I've passed them on to my son. But he's a combination of my son and my husband. And so those areas or traits that you have are passed on to your children. And in fact, I knew nothing about primitive reflexes. And if I had have done, I'd have been able to catch these reflexes quicker, because by retention of them, this is the foundation of the nervous system. So if you look up something called I'll send it to you. You can put it in the notes, but it's called the pyramid of learning. And at the bottom of the pyramid is these reflexes in the nervous system. And then on top of that is your sensory system. So how your eyes align, your auditory processing, your sense of touch, and your smell. All of these senses are then stacked on top of the reflexes. And then you have, as your brain develops, you have your fine motor and then your gross motor in terms of big level movements. And then you have your ability to learn, which is at the top of the pyramid. So when you have children that are finding it very, very difficult to learn, or that control their behaviors or control their emotions, when you do tests on them for their primitive reflexes, they've still retained them. So if you've still got a squishy foundation at the bottom of the learning pyramid, and they're still there, it's preventing these other functions to develop. So when you look at it from that simplicity, there is a root cause to why children have learning and behaviour issues and the ability to manage and regulate their emotions or connect. And some children have, a left brain weakness. So that was my son with dyslexia. And on that other side is dyspraxia and also dysgraphia. And on the right side of the brain, there is autism, OCD, ADHD, Asperger's. And when you look at it from those sides, those weaknesses are more prevalent in the research from Dr. Robert Melillo, who wrote Disconnected Kids. Now, that book changed my world because I realized there was a root cause to my son's problems. And, the things that I was experiencing with him once he got to about 4 or 5 with lack of speech, that's on the left side, dyspraxia and dyslexia are all on that left side, as well as, he had facial asymmetry on his left side. And that's, to do with your cranial nerves, which are located in your brainstem. So when you look at the kind of facial asymmetry, body asymmetry, maybe his left shoulder was up more rather than his, the symmetry that you should have on both sides of your body. One eye could be bigger than the other. Your right foot might turn in. That's to do with your left brain and your right cerebellum. So there's different things that you can see through the growth of your child. And it all relates back to the bottom, which is the root cause of these reflexes being retained. So if you can integrate them by using your sensory system. So if you think back to when that child was laying on the floor, all they've got at that point as a baby, a very small infant, is their sensory system. The light, the sound, touch. Those are the things that they are using most to grow that brain. If you use those senses and you use vibration for touch, you could use red or blue glasses for your eyes, and those are connected with different sides of your brain. And then you can use smell in terms of activating your olfactory bulb. You can use those different stimuluses and also sound in terms of different musics for different sides of the brain. You can then help integrate those reflexes. So there's just so much you can do for some of these children. And I'm so passionate about it because, you might get this diagnosis, but it doesn't mean to say there's nothing more you can do. They're just, at the moment in the UK, there is very little known about this. And a lot of the research is from doctors in the US. And there are certain doctors that, I've done training with. So Dr. Robert Melillo, and I'm on his practitioner directory. I've done training with Dr. Josh Madston. I know other doctors, Dr. Kyle Daigle and Dr. Brandon Crawford, and all of these names, they all have this experience. And there are, Dr. Connor Bohr, there's lots of them in the US, but nothing here. So my mission is to help as many parents as I possibly can in understanding these reflexes. And that's what I'm, specialist in and trained in. But there's so much more to it, and really understanding what's going on in the brain of a child with these different symptoms.
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite familiar with some of the stuff that you said related to, but it's always been in my world as far as sensory processing is concerned.
Yeah.
So sensory processing and sensory integration. Yeah. So I'm familiar with the learning pyramid, for instance, and that when we're born, we're essentially sensory processing machines. That's all we are, and the brain is completely environment dependent and environment reliant. So if I can't modulate my senses typically, or can't discriminate with my senses typically, then we go into a higher level of defensiveness rather than discrimination abilities. And that's kind of similar to what you were saying there with a slightly different language. So, and one of the things I think when we were chatting, we talked about the importance of kind of early recognition. So you said you trained in functional neurology when your son was 7 years old. So you kind of came into this. So was that too old for him? Was there still so much you could do at that time period? And how were you able to change his trajectory from that?
He's absolutely amazing now. And I'm just so happy where he is. So I don't need to worry anymore. And that's what I want to give to other parents. So where at the age of 7, we were at a point where he had these reflexes, and, it wasn't, so he was very anxious. He didn't cross crawl properly. So that was another sign. So, I realized this. He dragged his left leg, left brain. He had, massive amounts of speech delay. So that was really affecting him still at the age of 7. No ability to remember times tables or anything academic. We would start at ground zero every single time. He was very, very sociable. And that's, a really good trait of like a very strong right brain. But, he was academically not great, not good at following instructions. It was just lots of things that really held him back. And so what I did was I learned functional neurology from doing Dr. Melillo's course. And I got qualified in understanding these primitive reflexes. And I would come home after the course. I flew to Barcelona every single month to do this for 3 days. And I would come home and then I would look at all the videos and, all the course material, and I'd work out, because I'm not, I'm certainly, I'm a mother. I've got a very different career. I work in, managing teams in the tech industry for marketing technology. So I am not a specialist, like from an educational scientific background. But I went and learned this for the determination of understanding what I could do for my son. And I worked it out, and I worked out how I could navigate all of those very complicated neurology words and understanding the brain to what do I need to do with him to change his trajectory. And so I learned these reflexes, and I would practice on him because, that's what I wanted to come home and see if I could change that trajectory. And my God, I started to see changes within 2 weeks. So for a child of 6, 7 years old to not play with Lego, and we had a ton of it, I didn't realize so many things. I didn't realize that he couldn't actually pick up the pencil properly. He couldn't pick up the Lego pieces together and put them together properly. But if I integrated that Palmer reflex, he can now pick up Lego, and he plays with Lego. And within 2 weeks of stimulating his hand with vibration, he was actually picking up Lego. Now, it wasn't fully integrated in 2 weeks, but we've made such huge headway. We'd made that, that movement pattern had really started to change. And he was then using Lego and playing with Lego every single day. So for a 6 or 7-year-old boy not to play with Lego, it was quite upsetting for me when we had a ton of it in the living room and he wouldn't pick it up because he just couldn't do it. Yeah. But then he started doing it. And then we started doing a lot of movement around, there's another reflex around his ATNR. So that's an asymmetric tonic neck reflex. And this is the one that really holds back kids. So if you get your child on all fours and you make sure that their feet are straight, just laying on the floor, but they're on all fours, and you're going to, their elbows need to be loose but not locked. And then you turn their head to the side, and what you're going to see is their opposite elbow will bend if that reflex is actually present. And if you turn it to the other side, you're going to see the other side bend. Now, that reflex shouldn't be there. If you turn the head and the elbows don't bend, that reflex is, it's integrated, it's not there. But if it does bend, and it's sometimes the kids literally just, I have them in clinic, you turn their head and they literally collapse on the floor. So that's really quite a severe one. That 18R reflex is also called the fencer reflex. So you might see your child sleep like that with their arm straight out, and their other arm bent. And that is because they've got their head turned. And I've got a picture of my son at 9 months old when that reflex should have actually integrated. And, I look back now and go, oh my God, if I'd have known this, I could have helped him. But that reflex, the retention of that reflex holds back children from, their eye alignment, their sense of balance, their ability to take in instructions. That reflex is so critical and is always present in the children that I see that have either on the dyslexia side or even on the ADHD, Asperger's, like autism side. And integrating that reflex changes their world. And as soon as I integrated that reflex, the head of SEN came to me and said, "What have you done with him?" And I said, "Why? What have you seen?" And he said, "His level of attention and focus and ability to be in the room is very different. Tell me what you've done." And that man said to me, "I want to know because I want to see if I can do it with more children." And I helped him put a sensory program together because they'd done sensory circuits for like 6 years. And he said, "I don't think it's helping any of these kids. If there's something that can help them, what are you doing that I can put in place for a 10 to 15 minute program every day with these children?" And so I put that in place, and the teachers started to see changes in these children because they were activating and using these reflexes. And he was doing sensory stimulation as well with them. It was quite amazing. But when children didn't go to sensory circuits that day, the teachers knew it. And one of the mums came back. I've got a video of him talking about it. But one of the mums came back and said, "What are you doing with my little girl in sensory circuits? Because she's coming home and she's talking to me more. Like something's changed." So it was, the difference is quite phenomenal. And I'll give you an example. I saw a parent with a little boy, and it's quite emotional. I saw a parent with a little boy, six weeks, 10th of May it was, and he wrote to me this week, Monday, and it blew me away because he's been doing with his, I think he's 4, his little boy. He's been doing these reflexes exercises with using, sensory stimulation. And it's been quite phenomenal because he said the progress has been so good in 6 weeks. He's like, his nonverbal communication's coming on a lot. He's been waving and pointing. He didn't do that before. He started to understand things that we're asking him to do, and he's trying to make more sound and noises because he's on the spectrum. He's sometimes copying animal noises and recently started to say no and all gone, whereas they didn't have any words previous to this. So, he's going on to the next stage in the program, but that's in 6 weeks. Imagine what you can do like over the period of 6 months to a year with your child, because it's not, if you've got a child that is 7 years old, you've got 7 years of brain development there. And doesn't mean to say that you can't change it, because before the age of about 12, all of the grey matter is still developing, because you've got grey matter and you've got white matter. So when you look at the grey matter, that's the buildings in the city. The white matter are the roads and the road system. So that still develops all the way up until 20. So the ease of doing this with your child, kind of is guided around those types of ages. But after 20, you can still change it and integrate those reflexes. So it just takes longer. So you've got such a great opportunity before the age of 12 to establish better buildings and change the grey matter and get rid of the reflexes, utilize that sensory system to do that. And you can really help change their trajectory and move that child from what they're going to struggle with continuously because they can't move properly. So it's those movement patterns. So I used to get really frustrated with my son because, he wouldn't listen, or he wouldn't, take on the instructions, or he'd forget, or, there would be so much on my side, I think back to now, that I feel terribly guilty for, or he couldn't hold the pencil, and I didn't realize that it's not his fault. He had these movement patterns, these reflexes that hadn't integrated. And as soon as I helped him integrate them, things started to open up. It was like a whole different world. And he's 14 now. He's doing exceptionally well at school, getting 50, 60, 70%. Now, for a dyslexic child to do that and get those are just normal grades for most children that are average. not a dyslexic child that had sensory processing and speech issues. And he couldn't put words and sentences together. He could barely speak. He could say certain words. I knew what he wanted, but nobody else knew what he wanted. And that was the difficulty at school, because he couldn't negotiate. And, it was very hard for him in the playground to get across what he wanted. But he's doing exceptionally well now. And if I hadn't done all of this, I basically grew his left brain. That's what I did for him.
Yeah. Well, that's what it sounds like, as you kind of summarize what you were saying there, from what I can kind of gather, is obviously you're referring quite a lot to obviously neuroplasticity, that the brain is, constantly changing, developing, and laying down new neuron pathways. You use the building and road analogy, which I quite like. I always use the forest analogy, that we start off with a meadow, and it's easy to create the paths, running around all over the place. And then we get to 50 and it's more like a jungle. So we can create new neuron pathways, but it's a little bit of machete and working hard to do it. But obviously, if we don't run down those paths, they don't grow, they don't maintain, they get grown over. So as kind of following that metaphor across, I'm kind of taking it then that what you do is, for whatever reason, certain things aren't developing typically in a child's brain. So you almost have to overactivate. It's almost like if you want them to learn to ride a bike, you don't just get them on it once and go, right, that's it, you know it now. You have to go, right, you're going to need to practice a little bit more than most children will. So you're going to be on that bike every day, whereas some could just pick it up by doing once. Is that a kind of a following that analogy across?
Yes, it's the same kind of analogy, but using those reflexes. Because I said to you about that fencer reflex, right? So if you think about a child that has their ATNR reflex, every time they move their head, their arm goes out. So if you've got a child on a bike, every time they move their head to look left and right, there's that automatic movement pattern that's happening, because that reflex is still there. And there's a phenomenal video I saw, one of, Dr. Belinda Palmer put it up a couple of months ago, with a little boy that had a retained reflex, an ATNR reflex. And every time he moved his head to look right, his handlebars would wobble, and he just didn't like it, because that reflex was still there. So if you realize that how they move and how they behave is related to, the retention of these reflexes, you can change it by integrating them, by activating, like you said, doing something over and over again. You can activate the reflex to integrate it. So the more you use it, like where these reflexes should have integrated by the age of 12 months old, or, the 6 months mark is when the ATNR should actually integrate. If they haven't integrated it by then, you can activate it for them by, the movement of their head is actually the activation of their neck and their head to integrate it for them. And by integrating it, you're going to help the brain to develop in a better way. And we've all got imbalances, but these reflexes are holding these children back from being the best version of themselves. And that's why, that it's really important that you have a reflex test done to understand.
I suppose it's going back to really, as you said, it's, if they can't ride the bike, we might just think it's related to, well, we just need to keep trying this. But until you get those reflexes right, they may never be able to ride the bike. It's going back to what we'd expect them to already know. So with something like, so you're looking for that bilateral kind of stimulation, aren't you? And something's not working properly over the corpus callosum. So you've got to go, right, we've got to build that first, and then we can move on to the higher skills.
Well, when you ride a bike, it's multiple movements, isn't it? So you're on something that's moving and it's a bit shaky and unstable. You've got your reflexes that every time you move your head, the handlebars move, but you're also needing to pedal at the same time. And that's like both sides of your brain need to be able to operate. And, you need to integrate those reflexes in order for that to actually happen, for both sides of the brain to grow. So, when I said to you that my son had, I grew his left brain, that's because his right brain had come on so much more than his left brain. And so by coming back to the beginning, to this reset button of, we're going to go to the foundation of the nervous system, and we're going to look at those reflexes, and we're going to use that sensory system to really reset the brain and set the foundations and put all those bricks in the wall at the bottom of the pyramid, so that the rest can start developing. that's what I'm, really passionate about, because there's the root cause. There's the bricks that are missing. Then we can start to get him to be more functional. And from that function of being able to move properly, the networks of the emotions and the ability to regulate and not be, some children that are kind of very left brain strong. So the autism, ADHD, they've got no brake pedal because their right side of their brain hasn't developed at the front, their prefrontal as much. And so they're always on. You've got that on button and they're just go, 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 but they haven't got the other side of the brain to kind of negotiate and say, hang on a second. Perhaps if you do that, there's a consequence. Most autistic children, there is no consequence. So, you can actually build that right side for that child by integrating and setting the foundations properly for those. And you can do right brain exercises. So, those are the things to help grow that right side, to open up those rivers that are just not flowing.
Let me ask you a question. Do you ever find the pressures of supporting, teaching, or caring for someone else overwhelming and wish you had access to more support and information? The Able to Care podcast, in connection with Able Training, has created the ablehub.uk, where for less than the price of a coffee a week, you can access exclusive podcast content, resources, events, and over 45 certified online courses, covering topics like self-care, understanding dementia, neurodiversity, first aid, conflict management, financial advice, and so much more, with new content and courses being added each month. We are so confident that you will benefit from the Able Hub that we are offering 14 days access completely free of charge. No contract, cancel anytime. Become part of the ablehub.uk community and gain the support, knowledge, and resources you deserve. Don't struggle alone. Be able. Find the link in the description. So I think you've given some examples there of some examples of reflex exercises with kind of, I take it, helping a person to manage their gripping reflex as one. I think you gave it the proper name.
What you can do, I can tell you some. Yeah, I can tell you some. So I said to you about the ATNR reflex, that asymmetric tonic neck reflex, and getting them on all fours and turning their head and see if their elbow bends. That's one.
Yeah.
The other is with the hand. What you can do is you can use a pen or, the end of a paintbrush, and you can go across and your X marks the spot for the treasure, right? So you go across the palm, and what you're going to see is some children have really strong reflexes where their hand will just literally clasp.
Right.
But others, if you continue to do it, you can actually, you can see their fingers coming in. And that is a reflex that should not be there. And that's going to hold them back from holding a pencil properly. The other is the facial one, because the hand and the face are very connected. Because this is, if you go back to very infantile, you use your hands to feed, right? So these two are very, very connected. And what you can do is you can get a little paintbrush, and you can go across the corner of their mouth and draw little cat whiskers on their mouth. And if you see their mouth kind of come towards the paintbrush or the pen, that's a positive reflex. And children that have speech issues, those two, the kind of the rooting reflex where the mouth is moving, like you should be able to go across your face and your face should not move. But what you do see is like, you can see the chin go up, or even the kind of the lips come out, or they move towards where as a child they would move towards the breast to feed, right? But in fact, that shouldn't be there. And sometimes, these reflexes are stronger one side than the other, depending on, the side of the brain that is stronger or weaker. But if you've got reflexes, you need to get rid of them. And that will really help in that child's, trajectory. But those two are very connected with the hand and the mouth. And that ATNR reflex, that head turning reflex is, you get rid of that. It's like it transforms that child, particularly in terms of, it's mad how you understand what information you take in, how you process, your ability to learn, because these reflexes there's other pieces I need to tell you, which is these reflexes are at the bottom of the pyramid of learning in that nervous system. But what sits on top of it is not only your sensory system, but your balance. So your vestibular system. So children that don't like climbing or have to hold your hand as they're walking along the wall, there's stuff going on with their vestibular system within their, their semicircular canals, within their inner ear, because the vestibular system hasn't developed either properly. And then on top of that, you've got your eye system, and that sits on top of your vestibular. So if you've got balance issues, you're going to have eye issues. You're not going to be able to track. So then that reflects into either, ADHD kind of symptoms because you can't focus, but also reading, and why children don't like reading if they're on the kind of the dyslexia side, because they can't track properly. Their eyes are not working properly. And they can't track together. So they're not converging and diverging properly. And you could actually do a quick test with your child and see if they follow your finger for 10, go to the middle and go across to the right and see if they follow your finger. And you could put a smiley face on the end of it so it's fun. But what you can do is you'll be able to see if their eyes skip and their eyes do not follow your finger and they skip. That is a huge sign that there's issues there with the ability for their eyes to track. It's not about getting them glasses. It's about training those networks specifically and what canals are off to actually get those systems working. But you can train that if you know it. So I had a little boy in the clinic who came in with ADHD, and he was on medication, but the medication made him effectively vibrate and become very sweaty, and he didn't like it. So he wanted to come off the medication because, after a period of time, medication doesn't help because you get used to the medication. But what we found was he had a few reflexes. His balance systems, there were a few things wrong, but his vestibular system in there with the balance, a few things were off. But he had a problem with his semicircular canals in his inner ear. And that then showed me, because we did some very basic eye tests, that those systems were the ones that were causing most of the problems. And he could not track one side. He could track perfectly on his stronger side of his brain, but his right side, he could barely track. And he found it so difficult when I put his head in certain positions to track, looking down, looking back, going across. He found it so difficult. And so I said to his mum, these are the issues that I'm seeing. And she said, but I've been to the optometrist. And I said, I know, but they don't look at it from these systems and system functions of reflexes, balance, and eye alignment. And she sat there and she cried and she said, if only somebody had told me this, I'd never have put him on the medication. So, we're working on that at the moment with him, and she's seeing, great results, less meltdowns. Because if your eyes aren't working properly together, and you don't know that, as a parent, you've got an expectation of your child. But as a child, you don't know what they don't know what they can't do or should be able to do, and they can't describe to you what's wrong. So it's about, it's like a puzzle map. You need to work out with your child where and what systems unstable or imbalanced, and then you can actually take the right corrective methods to fix that.
Yeah, it's so important. I think I found fascinating, and you've kind of already mentioned it a little bit. I think people may struggle to go, well, how do those, reflex movements around movement then impact on all sorts of other factors? And when I started to learn about this, it was like, if you take you mentioned the smooth pursuit movement there, which is, well, think about how many parents communicate. They tend to then point. Well, that pointing is follow my finger from here to here. So that's a smooth pursuit movement. So if I can't do that, if I'm explaining something to you, or go and pick up that ball for me, but my smooth pursuit movement, not only am I then struggling to engage and sort of connect and feel confident and build self-esteem through mastery, but also I'm losing out on opportunities for language development as you're using certain words. And so if I've got any sensory system difficulties, think about, go under the table and pick up that big ball. There's so many discriminatory elements to that and movement elements to that and tactile elements. So my language is going to be built through experience, through that sensory integration. So that's where it all interconnected, isn't it? If the one can't be met, that's going to impact on everything else moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it is about going back to the basics, or what I term as the root cause of what my son was going through. When I read that book and realized, oh my God, I can go and see an OT, I can go and see, a behavioral specialist, I could go and see an educational psychologist, I can go see so many different people out there that have different methods. But how do I know? Because some of these methods just come in like school. School comes in at the top of the pyramid. If you've got loads of squishy layers at the bottom and you can't really, like you just said, understand, process that information in the right way, you're not going to give the right response. But if you can fill the bricks in the wall that are missing at the foundation, and those reflexes build our brain. So if you've still got those reflexes in your 5 or 6, those things are still, there's gaps in the wall. And that's how I kind of think about it. And my son he had so many issues that he didn't understand properly. He couldn't tell me how he was feeling or what he was experiencing or why, because he couldn't describe, and he just didn't have that. And he would do he would get very frustrated, like lots of fist clenching. And so those, lack of words, like you need to know the developmental milestones of a child from, 12 months old to 2 to 4 to 6, and how many words they should be able to say and pick up and repeat. But he just didn't. He had, at the age of 2, you should have, well over 100 words, and he just nowhere near that. And so, when you have those kind of things that hold you back as you go through school, like speaking and telling a story and communicating, that's where school becomes so difficult. And when your memory isn't there either, and you can't, do the tests, or you can't write the little card out at Mother's Day, and what you get through is a load of different letters all over a page, because none of it really makes sense to him, because he's got no idea what, Happy Mother's Day is meant to look like. Those are the things that hold children back. And I think there's so much that I did right at the age of, between 6 and 7. And I really focused in on it for, 3 months. Like, it was 3 months, and, it carried on for 2 years, right? But it was 3 months of solid, I'm going to commit to you. And, you're going to help me by doing these exercises. I'm going to do them with you daily for 20 minutes. And some days I might do one of those exercises like that AT&R reflex twice, because that can really accelerate. And the more you do them, you're just opening up those rivers. But that ability to commit to him and do those exercises for 3 months, I then had a break for a few weeks. And during that break, you just start to see acceleration. So you see the changes as you go, but you don't recognize it. And I kept a diary. You don't recognize it enough until you walk into a playground with other children and you look at another child and go, oh my God, he hasn't done that in like quite a few weeks. And you forget those different behaviors because they literally go. And, you have a different version of your child in front of you month over month. And that's meant to happen. But with a child that has things holding them back, you don't see it because things change quite quickly. And so I did the break, and the break really gives the brain, the ability to kind of synchronize itself again. And then I went back to it for another 3 months, and I literally just went for it. I had the weekends off because you need a break yourself. But the commitment to him, I literally committed to him. I'm going to do this on the days I don't even want to do it either. When I'm tired and I've come home from London and, it's like 6, 7 o'clock at night, and I want to do these exercises with him because it's going to help him, I will continue to do them. But during, they might get sick and you don't do them for a week, but you just get back to it. But the consistency and persistency of those activated movements with stimulating the sensory system are the things that will, change that trajectory, that change the brain. It grows those networks, it opens those rivers, it fills the bricks in the wall.
Yeah. It's like short-term pain for long-term gain as a result of that.
Yeah.
It's actually life change by the sounds of it. So after helping your son, and obviously, you must have been converted as far as this is it, this has changed his life. How did you begin working with other parents then, which is what you do now?
Yeah. So I was like, I wanted to change the world when I read that book, Disconnected Kids, Realizing the Root Cause. But you can't change the world unless you've actually got some evidence. And, I'm not, although I'm trained in it, medical is not my background. And so you need to build that trust. But people had seen how Archie had changed. And they asked me, would you help me? Would you teach me what you know? And so I built out a website, which is braindevelopment.co.uk. I built that out, it's about 3 years ago now. And I worked with a doctor in the US, and we did an intensive, and we had patients in, and I learned a lot, during that process in how to run intensives. But I had also been part of running intensives too myself with Archie. So I'd taken him to the US just once. And then I'd had another intensive with him just for a week or 4 days in the UK when a doctor had come over here. So I'd done a couple of those. And so I knew how to do it. And I did intensives on Archie anyway. So he'd be coming up for his exams. And 2 weeks before, I would do an intensive on him, for a good hour a day with all of the equipment before he would go into an exam. And that really helped. But how I helped other people was it was either word of mouth or it was through my website. And because I'm on the Dr. Melillo's directory, as I'm a specialist in primitive reflexes, I then started to get people phoning me. So I don't do any advertising because I only want to work with small numbers of people. Mm-hmm. And I have, effectively helped individuals over a period of like 6 to 9 months and seen huge changes. And it was only recently, since about December time, that I decided I'm going to get, my website is going to start doing more. And so I've been doing more masterclasses and educating people. Like every couple of weeks, I run masterclasses, and you can find those on braindevelopment.co.uk/events. And I teach people about primitive reflexes. And then, I offer my services for assessments, and I run a clinic in Kent, in Cranbrook. And I do that at the weekends. So I've got a clinic on Saturday and Sundays. And I also help parents online. So if parents in the US that I've also been working with want to understand reflexes, I literally get on the floor and I show you the reflexes online, and I will, do those reflexes to help you understand how to do them and how to use the sensory system. And I build out, from the questionnaire that I have, I can see all of the reflexes within that questionnaire as to what that child is like managing. And then what best ones we could put in the home care plan to focus in on. I will also look at, are they more left brain? Are they more right brain weak? And then what other exercises we should be doing? How are their bowel movements? What's their gut health like? I've got an amazing woman that I work with in the UK who does lab testing and has healed her own autistic daughter. So by just focusing in on the gut, she is doing amazing. Her daughter's doing amazingly well. But the combination of us both working together on understanding what's going on internally to reduce the inflammation from the gut to brain axis on the brain, and understanding if these children still have viruses that are causing problems in terms of brain inflammation, like strep, and we do organic acid testing as well as stool testing. So we really understand what's going on inside. And then we get rid of these reflexes. The trajectory of these children are going like that within months. And it's really, really exciting. Because I started working with some parents at Christmas, and, by February, they were like, I can't believe the changes we're seeing. And, by March and April, I've seen them in clinic. And then I've also been working with them online and over WhatsApp as well, to kind of just see little videos and, see how they're doing with integrating the reflexes. But if you really sort out the gut and you reduce the inflammation, those reflexes should go within a couple of months.
Wow. Obviously, you mentioned there as for how people can kind of find you, and we'll make sure all those details are in the show notes and description as well. So obviously, any parents out there that are noticing any of or concerned about any of the reflexes should definitely kind of reach out to you and kind of get some assessment or get some advice at the very least. So we'll put all those details in. Sort of last question, because I know that we're sort of getting close to time. What would you say are the biggest kind of misconceptions that sometimes people have about their own children or about this process? Where do you find the biggest kind of challenge against what you do?
I would say that they've been to many, many practitioners to find answers. And they're like, why are you different?
Yeah.
And they've spent a lot of money trying to find the answers. And there isn't a magic bullet. And they want somebody to help them, remove all these challenges from their children. And I think the easiest thing I can do is explain what I do and how I do it and what impact it's going to have on the brain and what you would expect. I think the hardest thing is for the parent to say, I'm going to commit to my son or my daughter to do these exercises, because the consistency and persistency of doing them helps exercise those automatic movement patterns that need to integrate. But what can hold them back is diet. So you really need to, have a clean diet. And sometimes clean, interestingly enough, clean diet, removing the gluten and dairy and all of those inflammatory foods that cause all of us, problems. Those are the things that you need to reduce the brain inflammation, reduce the amount of, overgrowths of microbiome that shouldn't be in the gut, and feed the good guys to help the brain develop, because it's all about what's going on in the gut to the brain axis. Reduce that inflammation. Sometimes those foods that you're feeding that you might think that they're clean are actually causing excitatory behavior. So blueberries or, overloading. They might eat, a whole punnet of grapes all in one go. That's not good. Because that's causing high amounts of sugar or oxalates like blueberries to ferment in the gut, which then causes the brain to just excite. And, it's causing that heightened behavior that you don't want to see, because you want an easygoing, calm child, but you haven't. You've got a child that's bouncing off the walls. So there are certain things that, you can also understand more about in what you're feeding your child and what is going to be more beneficial to them. But, meats, vegetables, small amount of berries, but, just not overdosing on certain foods. But, the sensory side, you might have a child that just likes eating lettuce, like iceberg lettuce. And it's that crunch, they need to feel it. And the reason that they get that sensory system is it's hard for them to they only want to eat, crunchy foods, is because they can actually feel their mouth. So, I talked to you about the rooting reflex. They can't feel their mouth. They can't feel their body in space. They can't feel their tongue. So how do you expect them to speak? There's lots of things that come before, a speech comes. There's lots of developmental milestones that need to happen before speech develops. So, I mean, I've given you a ton there, but those are the things that I come across, because parents, like I did, spent a lot of money before finding these methods. But these methods work, and I truly believe in them.
Yeah. Well, I say you've obviously got that huge confidence from your own experiences, and it sounds like you've also helped a lot of other families as well. Well, thank you so much for spending a bit of time talking to me about it. It is a fascinating topic, and it kind of does underpin a lot of the stuff I do is sensory processing, because it does kind of tie in really nicely with that, of kind of managing expectations, but also kind of wanting the best for the outcomes for your child, which is, they're lovable just the way they are, but also can we provide them opportunity to thrive in the world that they're in as well, which is what, hopefully every parent wants for their children. So thank you so much. And we'll make sure there's a way that people can contact you and find you on the podcast. So thank you very much for your time today, Lara.
Yeah, it's absolutely fun. I've loved it. Thanks so much for having me on.
So anybody who's listening, if you did find today's episode useful, interesting, please like, comment and share, especially share it with somebody that you think could benefit from this or would like to, is concerned about their child and would like to know more, or any new mother that's maybe those signs to watch out for as well in the early stages. The earlier that we can take action, whichever route you're going down, the better for the well-being of yourself as well as your child to a degree. But otherwise, thank you very much. See you next time.